All right, we'll go ahead and get started, and folks can join us as we go. Bojo, welcome to today's webinar. It's our last webinar in this Ag Census series, and we are so grateful to have you join us today. So who are we? We're the Indigenous Food and Ag Initiative. We're based out of the University of Arkansas School of Law, but we serve tribes and tribal producers all over the country with our policy and research expertise. Sorry, I'm not being able to talk all of a sudden today, as well as, we do things with our tribal enterprise team. We have youth programs. We do a lot across Indian country food and ag. And one way to put it is we put tribal sovereignty and food sovereignty. So that's a little bit about us at the Indigenous Food and Ag Initiative. My name's Belle, and I'm the communications director for us. And I'm also a citizen of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation out of Shawnee, Oklahoma. And I just wanted to welcome you all here today. I'm going to be helping moderate, so I'll be in the background looking for y'all's questions. So feel free to toss questions at any time in the chat. We will have a designated time at the end where we'll be able to have open dialogue, but feel free at any time if something pops up that you have a question about, put that in the chat and we'll get to it. This is being recorded so that we can share this out after the webinar concludes. So folks that weren't able to make it, or maybe you want to look back at something that we talked about and refresh your memory. So we'll be able to have that and make that accessible to everybody in the coming days, shortly after the webinar concludes. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Jamie Black. She's going to be actually hosting today. So Jamie, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Belle. Hi y'all. If you have been a part of the on this series with us before, you know who I am. I usually host these. Um, I am the political assistant here at IFAI. I get the pleasure of going through all these reports and basically doing all the nerdy stuff so I can give it in a more digestible manner, just like we've done with this webinar. So I've had a real blast doing this webinar, and I hope that any of you guys who have joined us have learned a lot. And if you're new here, I hope you're going to learn a lot today. So, here's our agenda. And today we're going to be talking specifically about reservation data. But since this is our last webinar in the series, we are going to do just a brief highlight of the past webinars before diving into the new NASS reports. And after going through that, we're also going to touch on the final numbers that have come out on the race, ethnicity, and gender profiles. And then from there, we're going to go into what's next for the Census of Ag. And of course, if you guys have any questions at any time, like Belle said, you can drop them in the chat, but we're also going to have some designated time at the end to have a kind of an open discussion. So without further ado, we're going to just hop right in. So our previous census agriculture webinars have been about the history of the Census of Agriculture, the acreage in Indian country, the market value that we've seen, and emerging trends. And then our most recent one was busting some myths about Indian country agriculture. So the highlights from our first webinar, we went over the history of the ag census and specifically with Indigenous people in the contact. So we've gone through the different eras. There were many. We started with colonial contact and how that has kind of started with agriculture and how they started to count those things. And now we're currently in the self-determination era. The biggest takeaway from this webinar was really just that there's been a long and sometimes really dark history associated with agriculture in Indian country and specifically how they have counted Indian country agriculture. So it's led to a really great sense of distrust and a lot of inaccurate counts. But we've come a really long way from where we started, and we're still hopeful that we're just going to continue to go up from here. So our second webinar, oh, that's the opposite way. Our second webinar was just going over the acreage. again, this is another kind of contentious thing, counting the land. But basically, the skinny of it all was that we've seen an increase from the number of acreage and farms since 2017. So that could be due to a number of things. We'll also get into that later. The third webinar was over market value, and we had a lovely guest speaker. Sky Ducheneau had jumped on and kind of helped us show how market value works on the like actual boots on the ground and how producers are using that to determine things. But the overall picture is that there are more than 58,000 producers on over 63 million acres that have produced 61 or $6.1 billion of agriculture products for Indian country. Um, they've just shown steady growth. Indian country's just shown steady growth, especially compared to the national averages. Those are numbers that we're really excited to be able to report. And then our fourth webinar was trends. Again, kind of just basic. There's been a lot of increases. Farms and acres have increased, but the number of producers has relatively stayed the same. So this kind of tells us that a lot of operations have expanded. So that's exciting. And then our myth busting webinar was a lot of fun, and we went over 5 different myths. The first one was that the family farm is dying. We busted that because there's an increase of Indigenous family farms and young producers. Um, then our second myth was that Native Americans only raise bison. We've only seen growth in that sector, and Indian country ranchers actually mostly farm and ranch cattle and milk cattle as well. The third myth was that agriculture is mainly just big ag, just not true for Indian country. There are 30 less than 30% of all Indian country farms produce less than $1,000, and 64% of all Indian country farms produce less than 10,000. So those are your mom and pop type operations. This is your farmers market, not big ag. So that one was busted wide open. Um, and then we also busted that tribal farmers are heavily supported by the government. Also, just not true. There are a very small number of American Indian farms with credit commodity corporation loans and just different other federal government assistance. And then the last myth was that farming's only done by one sex. And American Indian, Alaskan Native farms are pretty much neck and neck with male and female producers. So again, that one was pretty easy to bust. You can think about how Native American culture just largely was feminine through the matriline. I know for my tribe, at least, like the women were in charge of farming and things like that. So I think a lot of that's wrapped up in tradition. But yeah, so that was pretty much all of the content that we've covered thus far. And then from there, we are going to be talking about the reservation data specifically. So the NASS is the National Agriculture Statistics Survey, if you didn't know what that meant. And it's a report that's given out by the USDA, and they have specifically released reservation-specific data for 84 tribal reservations. Now, we know that that's not totally encompassing of Indian country. That's not nearly as many reservations that there are. But the reservations that they reported and counted were actually determined by self-reported agriculture activity. So this just means that if a producer filled out the report, they specifically noted that they were on a reservation. And then they would specify which. So they were able to build this report based off of what people self-identified. And the intent of this was just to measure the total agriculture on farms and ranches that at least had some agriculture production on the reservations during 2022. And this specifically requested the number of acres that were used for livestock or on cropland, the number of cropland harvested, um, and the percentage of like livestock on the reservation. So all this is to say that this is not a holistic look of reservations in general, but just the ones that were reported on. Um, and I'd also like to note that this could be because this census took place in 2022, and it wasn't until 2020 that the United States Supreme Court case, McGirt v. Oklahoma, was ruled in 2020, which just basically affirmed that um, tribal nations on treaty land were technically reservations, and like it was supported by the Supreme Government. So we've seen a huge shift in that for many things, especially here in Oklahoma, where I'm from. It pretty much has shifted everything. Um, and so a lot of people maybe in 2022 didn't exactly know that they were on reservation land specifically. So they didn't know to report it. So that's kind of where that 84 number comes from. We were able to dig into that a little bit more, um, just to have a better explanation. Because when I first looked at it, I was confused. I was like, there are way more than 84 reservations. Um, so to access the actual data, you're going to go to nass.usda.gov publications ag census 2022. And when you get there, your laptop screen or computer screen is going to show the subject series when you scroll down. And we're looking at the American Indian Reservation specifically. You're going to want to just look at the PDF version. That's just my best advice. The text one is just weird text on like HTML. Just go for the PDF. And then once you get there, it's going to look something like this. And then if you keep scrolling down past all the forwarding and stuff like that, it is actually going to show you the data. And so I'll also just talk a little bit more about how they have collected the data. They had a multi-stage strategic communications campaign. And all this is basically just to say that they were really diligent in the outreach that they had to Indian country specifically. The communications campaigns focused on partnership building, local level outreach, public relations, media relations, paid media, social media, and then some paid advertising, but they didn't have a very large budget for it. Um, so it was a lot more outreach than we've seen in the past. And as we've talked about in some of our other webinars, that outreach really wasn't done. So it was refreshing for me as the researcher to see them very clearly say we were trying to be very diligent about this. Um, so yeah, that's all just to say that this is a pretty good snapshot of what we're looking. It's not completely whole, but it's a pretty good snapshot. Um, the data collection is also something called field enumeration, which I learned is basically just a collection of data through things like surveys and just intentional outreach. So, since there are 84 different reservations accounted for in this report, we are not going to go through all 84. We don't have the time and I don't want to. So we are just going to take a look, um, sort of like a zoomed in look on the Blackfeet Nation specifically, just to kind of give you guys an idea of what the data is that they're reporting on. So here is for the Blackfeet Nation specifically. We can see actually pretty staggering numbers that in 2017, there was a total of 478 farms reported. But in 2022, there were only 206 farms reported on the Blackfeet Nation, by Indigenous producers specifically. Me and my colleague Mary Belle were actually discussing maybe why they had these numbers so different. And it could be that there weren't as many farms that filled out the survey this year. It could be just a number of different things, but it is interesting to see that staggering difference, especially when you look at other numbers like land and farms. They're very close, like very close to each other, especially for the discrepancy in the number of farms reported. So, again, a lot of speculation can be made. We don't know for certain why these numbers are different and why these numbers specifically are very similar. It could mean that a lot of farms have sort of consolidated and like they are still on the same amount of land, but there's less operations going on. Um, so another just interesting look into this reservation specifically. And the total number of cropland has gone up from 107,000 to 11 or 116,000. Again, very weird for the number of farms total to go down, but cropland to increase as well. And then irrigation, massively different numbers. And we also discussed that there could be a number of different factors as to why this irrigation count is different. Maybe they are doing different ways to water their crops, different grazing practices. The Blackfeet Nation has also implemented their AMRP, which is their agriculture marketing plan. And so it could have just affected things very differently. So this is just a really interesting zoomed in look to the information that was reported for reservations specifically. Like I said, you can go through all 84 reservations and see this information for each. We just wanted to look at Blackfeet as sort of like our case study. Um, yeah, so this is just talking about the campaigns and the outreach, just like how I discussed earlier, how they got the data and why it's so important that their outreach was so thorough. But again, there's still a lot of opportunities for them to improve on that. Um, Maybe it could even just be as simple as people watching these webinars and realizing that this work is really important and these numbers do mean a lot, especially for things like influencing policy and research, just like what we do here at IFAI. Again, oh, I guess I just jumped ahead of myself. I got too excited about the data collection. That shows you how deep I've been into this. Um, and then also the Navajo Nation data visualization report isn't out yet. They said that it's to be determined, but all of the data for the Navajo Nation is specifically out, just not their visualization report. So I think that that basically just means that they're waiting to make it pretty. So that will be here sometime. You can check on the NASS website for that. And I'm sure we'll also post about maybe when that will be released. And then these are the race, gender, ethnicity profiles. We kind of hinted at these in our last webinar, myth busting, because this data report came out on June 28th. So we were able to use a lot of these numbers for the myth busting webinar. And these just kind of give another zoomed in look at the American Indian, Alaska Native producers in a more thorough lens. Like the number of farms. Oh, I think we have zoomed in. Yeah. So the number of farms is now at 58,366, whereas in the original NASS report from 2022, I think the number was like in the 40,000s. So we see a lot more specific numbers, a lot more thorough numbers. Same with land and farms and acres. We had the 6.3 billion figure, but this one's just a little bit more specific. The average size of farms is about 1,000 acres. the total market value, again, the 6.1 billion, but this is honestly very close to 6.2 billion, which very exciting that that's the market value. Government payments, 268 million, the farm related income, 391 million, total farm production expenses, 5.5 billion. So we can see that like Indian country ag is a big operation. It's not something just to be swept under the rug. And that's kind of why we do this and we are looking at it. Also, the big picture, we've got 1.3 billion in net cash farm income. There's also 45% of crops out of their share sales, and then 55% come from livestock, poultry, and different products. Um, so again, a big market. The land and farms by use, there's 10% of cropland for American Indian and Alaska Native farmers, 77% pasture land, and 8% woodland, 4% other. I was just saying that I think it's interesting that woodland is considered land and farms. I just had never thought about it that way, but it's how people are reporting their data and reporting, yes, these are my farm lands. It's being used for agriculture. So that's just an interesting number, I thought. And then I think, yeah, that's pretty much all that was on the race, gender, ethnicity profiles. It's only like a 2-page sheet, very easy to digest, very like visual data that they put out. I think Mary Belle probably dropped the link for that in the chat as well. So I highly recommend everyone to at least check out the prettier data sets that aren't in the hundreds of pages. Um, but I think that is all the content we have. So if anybody has any questions, even if you just have any like comments or anything of how your experience with the ag census has been, the floor is open now for anything and everything.
Thank you, Jamie. Well, as people are thinking about getting their questions in, we did have one. So, what are the most surprising trends that IFAI found during your research?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I feel like I'm constantly surprised. Also, I'm pretty new in this sphere. I am a recent college graduate, and so just getting to learn about it all is very exciting to me because I grew up on a farm in Oklahoma and it all feels so small and local and everybody's got a farm around you, so it's just the norm. So seeing these numbers is just always surprising and interesting. But I think that the biggest thing that was like just very cool is that there has been huge growth in the poultry production. So from 2017 to 2022, there was an increase of 106% from egg and poultry production. So that's huge that tribes are deciding to, utilize that as part of their production. And I know we've seen a huge increase too in livestock and butchering and things like that. And so it's exciting that they're also expanding that to poultry.
Yeah, I think that was really interesting to see the poultry increase. Also, you mentioned earlier in your presentation too about cattle production. And, that's 39% of all livestock production for American Indian, Alaska Native producers, which is substantial, but also not surprising to me because I grew up on a cattle ranch in Northwest Oklahoma where my parents still live and have a small cow-calf operation. So it's really not surprising from my upbringing, but it's cool to see the data and to, see that. So, and then, young producers, we kind of alluded to this too, because it's something we've highlighted in past webinars, but the young producers aspect and seeing so many, getting into production, even if it's not a huge production, but us really getting back to our roots and finding opportunities, expand opportunities within our communities for our families. So that's been really cool.
I also agree. And it's something special to me because I actually joined on with IFAI initially with the youth summit that we host. And so the whole point of that is that we need to have more youth engagement in agriculture. And, knowing that we've had this youth summit going on for 10 years now, and to see a huge spike in young producers entering this space, it's almost like, wow, like we actually have data for seeing maybe the contributions that this has had. So I think that's exciting. And just the economic impact of it all, too, is really staggering to be like, wow, this isn't just, even though a lot of the operations are smaller, mom and pop, farmers market, it's still bringing in $6.2 billion dollars. Like that's a lot. And so that's really exciting. Um, and just again, the number, almost 80,000 Native American and Alaskan Native producers. I would have never guessed that. Like before I got into this space, I would have never guessed that.
And there's a lot of producers across the country doing great work. And I know you also kind of alluded to this too, but what could the Ag Census and NASS do to improve data collection and improve the next Census of Agriculture, which is going to be happening in just a few years? I know that's crazy to think, but it happens every 5 years. So 5 years from 2022 is 2027, if I did my math correctly. So actually crazy far away either. So what are some things that maybe NASS can do to improve?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's one thing that a lot of people always have on their mind. The first thing is just partnerships, like they're trying, or like they've reported that they're trying to do in the with the reservation specifically, if they partner with more organizations like us at IFAI or at the Intertribal Agriculture Council, it can kind of help spread the word about the ag census. And just like us having these webinar series, we're kind of able to explain that, yeah, there is a bad history, but it's not a bad thing. And it actually is really helpful. NASS can also work more with cross-agency collaborations, um, just like non-government agencies called a lot of the time NGOs. Um, there can always be just improvements on that end. Um, but then just a lot of like more tribal feedback. You know, some communities may not have the access to the internet to do these kind of reports. Some of them may need a little bit more assistance. So, what works for one community isn't going to work for another. And that outreach can't just be so black and white and formatted. So, it's really just not taking a cookie cutter approach, tailoring it more to the people that they're trying to reach. Um, and then also, just like we talked about as well, that a lot of tribal nations are now formally recognized as reservations, and a lot have also been re-recognized by the federal government. So we're going to have access to data to these specific reservations. And that just didn't really happen, especially in eastern Oklahoma. And we know that that is a pretty large part of tribal agriculture. I mean, especially like I'm from eastern Oklahoma, and I can tell you, we've got a lot of tribal producers out there. And so that was my first thought was I cannot believe that the Cherokee Nation was not one of the reservations counted in the 84, Choctaw Nation, Muskogee Nation, So there's still a long way to go. But I think by like sharing the proper information too, it's going to kind of help improve Indian country stats.
Well, this is an easy question. How can folks access past presentations or videos that we recorded?
Yeah, so Mary Belle is a tech wizard, if you guys didn't know. And she and some other people from our team have really cultivated our website to be super user friendly. All the past presentation slides as well as our webinar recordings are on our website at indigenousfoodandag.com. And then we also have our videos, I think, on our YouTube page, right, Mary Belle? So you can see it on all platforms. And then if you guys ever do have just specific questions, you can email us. And I think we'll include our email at the end of this. But yeah, so all of our stuff is super easy to access. Even if you just go into our like landing, our homepage, you can go into the search bar and type in Ag Census and it pops up all of it too. So you don't even have to go hunting through it.
Okay. So got a few more questions in. So what are some of the priorities that you're hearing from young Indigenous producers? Jamie, I'll let you take that since Jamie helps so much with our annual youth summit and our youth outreach and really uplifting our youth programming, even on campus. So we are at the University of Arkansas. We do try to do as much as we can to support Native students across the university. And, you know, we have lots of partnerships that help make all of that outreach possible. But Jamie, I know, you know, you do a lot of that work alongside our next gen team. So I'll let you actually answer that.
Yeah, absolutely. That is one of my favorite things is working with the next generation. And, it's funny because I'm the age of a lot of them. So sometimes they're like, you are a part of our generation. And I'm like, yeah, but I'll be like the old lady doing the work behind the scenes. But yeah, so a lot of I feel like we all have heard of like land back and buzzwords like that. And obviously, climate solutions are something that's on the forefront of everyone's mind. And a lot of the young producers that I talk with and I work with, they're very interested in land stewardship and conservation. I would say that that's probably one of the top. And then also something that is kind of overlooked often is the health aspect of it all and just getting back to our own tribal healthy diets and the way that we get our food. That's health is always one of our very first tracks to fill up for our youth summit, which is, I think it's really awesome, especially since so many tribal nations try so hard to make that a priority, especially for youth to be thinking of. So yeah, definitely like land stewardship, conservation, and then just also being mindful about the earth and how we're respecting the earth and how we get our food and indigenizing sort of our diets.
I would only add one thing to that because I really think you did a great summary. And you know, we as Indigenous folks know how it's all connected, and it's very entwined from our food to our culture to our language. It all goes together, and it's all a big circle. But one thing, like from something I heard on the road, I got to go out and do a lot of roundtables with the Native Farm Bill Coalition ahead of putting together Gaining Ground, which includes like 150 priorities for the next Farm Bill. But thinking about like Farm Bill priorities, which, you know, we have a looming deadline coming up September 30th, where the last Farm Bill is supposed to expire, or they're going to have to do an extension like they did last year. We'll see what happens. But at the end of the day, you know, something we heard from youth too was like the research aspect, the support for TCUs, the support for education, even, you know, FERTEP agents. So there's folks out in their communities that are able to help navigate, you know, starting and producing. And so those are just some other areas, I think, like the education side too. But yes, most definitely health and taking care of our land and really thinking more on that 7 generation track. What are we doing today to ensure that we're able to produce the fuel fiber and, you know, things that we need to survive, produce food for the next 7 generations to come. And then again, it's all intertwined. So I think that's a great question. And then one more question. So have we really been able to do any economic analysis on the community home level, looking at that $6.2 billion economic contribution? And I'll say we haven't done a ton of like deep dive into the specifics of that. So I can't really say one way or another, but we can like look at um, how that might shape up on the different areas within this reservation data, where it does break down some of the different areas of production and look at it from that way to kind of see on the ground what's going on. Um, but
Yeah,
yeah, no, that's a really good question.
well, I can also add that the the NASS reports get so specific. I mean, it goes down to county level. So if you go in and you want to look at the like if you go into the race, ethnicity, and gender profile specifically, it starts off with kind of the holistic United States overall, which is what we just talked about. But then you can also click on state, and it'll tell you the state overall statistics and how many Indigenous farmers are in that state. But then you can click even further and go down to the specific county. Um, but since that information's so dense, we couldn't really articulate that very well in the short amount of time that we have this webinar for. But yeah, it can get as specific as you want it to, really. Um, I know I've looked at my own like home county just to look, and it pretty much will tell you like, oh, well, there's X amount of farms in this county that are indigenous produced. Here's the land. And if you're familiar enough with your area, you can be like, oh, I know who has those farms. I know who those producers are. So you can get very specific with the data.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, we can also make all kinds of speculations or, come up with big picture ideas of what could be contributing to this growth. And, part of it might even be that tribes have had more opportunities to do procurement locally of foods for their nutrition programs, for their elder programs, like the Osage Nation with their meat processing facility and being able to ensure that their folks have access to those meats, whether it's their kids to their elders, and really, having a place for Osage producers to then, sell their products as well and get their products processed. I mean, there's been so much momentum and it's been really inspiring. I will say, like, looking back at like the past 10 years of native agriculture where in my past life I was a reporter, so one of my big beats was Native American food and agriculture, and being able to see that growth and to see the things happening on the ground, to see people in my tribe really being interested in this space and growing our ag programs where we can, and also seeing other tribes follow suit and do even more in my community too. That's been just really cool. So I'd say it's, there's a lot of grassroots that probably contributes to this too, but it's such an inspiring time to be in this space and to really seeing the rejuvenation of our, traditional ways. And again, it plays into our language, those plants that we all have those connections, and it's all integral to who we are as Indigenous people and who we are to our communities. So I think it's just, again, an inspiring time to be part of Native American agriculture. I love seeing the youth, and I know that we are in good hands for the future generations because those youth are coming up with the most innovative solutions while also, leaning on our traditional tribal ecological knowledge too, and being able to really combine all of that. And it's just really beautiful. So I think, again, there's probably a lot that contributes to that growth, but it's also the people on the ground, those people working in the background that are helping make it possible to, adding farmers markets too to different tribes. So many tribes have added farmers markets in the past 10 years, and that provides some place for tribal producers to actually sell their goods too. So there's just so many areas that we've seen growth in that probably contribute to that, nearly $6.2 billion economic impact. So well, all great questions. And if you do happen to have a question after we wrap this up, you are welcome to email us. Jamie, I don't know if you're able to pull back up the slides and show how folks can follow us on different social platforms. But that's a good way to stay up to date on anything going on with IFAI. We try to share out relevant news and information when it comes to policy, research, youth opportunities. So definitely check us out if you have an opportunity. Um, I'll put
Is
my,
it showing the?
no, it's not, but that's okay. We can put our emails in the chat real quick
Oh,
for
weird.
everybody so y'all can see that.
Here, I'll stop the share then.
Well, Chi everyone, thank you so much for joining us throughout this series. It's been insightful. We've had a lot of fun doing the research and diving into these stats. And we're grateful for you all for, coming and attending. It's been, about like a 6-month webinar series. So thank you guys again for joining us, for all the great questions and dialogue. I hope you will find us on socials. You'll go, and if you haven't already, I would highly recommend you sign up for a newsletter. We send that out weekly with great information, as well as our policy brief. We send that out that way too. So if there is anything though that y'all need, reach out to us. We're happy to answer anything we can. And again, Chi, thank you so much for joining us. And Bama P, we'll see you later.